we have human rights because we're created in the image of God, because God gave us human rights. Otherwise, there's no objective reason why there should even be a such thing as human rights. And as we move further away from the Christian foundations of our society, people are going to realize that all those wonderful things that we took for granted, all the fruit of that Christian society are going to go, and that's going to be unpleasant for everyone.
Hey everybody, welcome to the show. I am delighted about my two guests today. You are going to love the information. It's a little bit terrifying what is going on in our world. And in fact, my first guest is Alex Newman, and he is an author, a journalist, he's a speaker. He talks about the deep state, he talks about education. He's an expert in all things in the USA, and he's up here in Canada, and we're really thrilled because what is going on in other parts of the world is also going on in Canada. And my second guest is Tanya, and she is a good friend, Action for Canada. She has tremendous emails that let everybody know all kinds of things that are happening, and you'll want to get on her email list. So we'll put that graphic up so that you can do that. Alex, let's start with you. One of your books, just one of them, is Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. And you are here for a conference, ironically, that's called What in the World is Going On? It's a prophetic conference. And I think we're all asking that, especially in the education fields and many other things that you're dealing with. So tell me in a snippet, sort of what is this about?
Well, what's happening is that the government school system now has become a tool to indoctrinate and dumb down our children and prepare them to move into what these elitists describe as a new world order. And so they're being used to turn our children against our freedoms, against our churches, against basically the fundamental principles that created our civilization, and prepare them to surrender their liberty, surrender their nation's sovereignty, and move into this kind of crazy global system that these people want to design. And the reality is that as long as they control the minds of the great majority of our children, they're going to win all the battles, and we need to understand that. So,
you know, I had no idea about this when my children were actually young, and then I started to see how my kids were framed so much by just simple, even comedic shows on television, that there was an agenda underneath it all. And Tanya, I know that you've been dealing with that here in Canada, that we have a serious issue with the indoctrination of our children.
We really do, you know, and as Alex is saying, this is part of a new world order, but it starts at the UN. They're trying to use our children as agents of change. You know, if you get the heart and the minds of the children when they're young, you control our future. And this is something we need to be very concerned about, but we need to start taking action, and we need to know who we're voting for and what those people believe coming into office. Are they going to support this, or are they going to work to move against it?
Right. And you know, online, people are talking about this new world order. How would you define the new world order?
Well, I think George H.W. Bush, who was our president in the United States some decades ago, really summed it up perfectly. He went on national television and he explained, anybody can see this clip on YouTube, that it's going to be a new world order in which a credible United Nations will use its peacekeeping role to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. And you know, we know a thing or two about the UN's peacekeeping role, that, you know, that's their military forces. It's kind of an Orwellian term they use. And these guys have a horrifying track record. I mean, I've been working with an organization called Hear Their Cries. They estimated that 60,000 women and children have been raped in the last decade by these UN troops. And then the second part of the claim there, that it's going to be a world in which we bring about the vision of the UN's founders. Well, we know something about the UN's founders too. On one side of the table you had Joseph Stalin, one of the most brutal mass murdering butchers to ever walk this planet. And then on the other side of the table you had the American representative. His name was Alger Hiss. They liked him so much they made him the Secretary General of the founding conference of the UN, and then a few years later we threw him in prison because he was working for Stalin. So you know, why would we want to give up the vision of our founders in America, who said God gave us rights and government exists to protect these rights, for the vision of these people? It's crazy, but
right.
He did us a service by telling us what was going on.
Right. And Tanya, we know that we're pretty upset because we see our Prime Minister signing on to UN initiatives like crazy, and we're all going, what are you talking about?
Right, and despite, major backlash from, the citizens of this country, he's going ahead, he's just moving this agenda forward so quickly that we can hardly keep up with it. I mean, the UN Global Compact on Migration, opening our borders, giving migrants more rights, more finances than our own Canadian citizens, who we've got the homeless, we've got the elderly that we're not properly caring for. Along with the UN Global Compact on Migration was the Sustainable Development Goals. But we've had prime ministers signing on to those for quite a number of years. Stephen Harper even signed on. So this is all about mass control. They want to control our resources, our education system, our banking system. We need to pull out of the UN. Right. That's the answer.
And it really makes no sense to me about why anybody thinks this is a good idea at all.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the indoctrination in the schools. I got a heavy dose of it growing up too. The UN is the savior of the world that's going to bring about peace in our time, and all these other platitudes that have no basis in reality.
Right.
All the while, we're giving up our liberty. We're allowing the UN to come into our schools, brainwash our kids, promote policies that are completely antithetical to everything that our civilization was founded on. And when you boil it all down, you really have a war on all the things that God has ordained. So
right.
We see the UN and their agents and their supporters in our governments waging war on family, on marriage, on nation states, on morality, even on objective truth. And the consequences of this are going to be disastrous.
Right. One of the things that we've dealt with heavily, Tanya and I have been very involved in, is the sexual orientation and gender identity being taught to our kids. How do you see the whole transgender thing and the indoctrination of that fitting into everything that you are talking about?
Well, I think one of the key things is that it's being used as a battering ram against Christianity, against the church, and against even just reality, fundamental truth. God created man and God created woman, and they're separate. And you don't even need to be a Christian to recognize this, right? God made a lot of things plain from the creation.
Right.
There's
Logical.
XX chromosomes and XY
Scientific.
chromosomes. Right, it's just an objective biological fact. And so here we have the UN and our governments telling us that somehow it's wrong for us to say something that is objectively true. You really need to start questioning the agenda at that point. And I think the agenda is to break down the churches, to break down Christian civilization, and move us into this totally ridiculous, crazy world order that they're building.
Right. And we have been really on the warfront of that, Tanya, here.
Absolutely. And what I see is that they're using this mind warfare, to silence opposition. So I feel like that, we're back in school and there's the bullies, they're using this technique of name calling, trying to shut somebody down.
Right.
And it's like, we need grown-ups in the room.
Yes.
We need grown-ups in government. By calling people intolerant, racist, bigots, homophobics, you're not accomplishing anything. We have reason to be concerned for our children and what they're teaching them. As we say, they're using them as agents of change. And, if we don't put a stop to this, there's a lot of harm that's being done.
Yeah, there really is. And one of the other issues that we're really dealing with is we get called, homophobe and transphobe, because we stand against, an anti-science, agenda in the schools. And I know that's going all over the U.S. as well. You've had a lot of experience with political Islam and some of the growing radical factions with that, and some experience being in other countries and seeing what has gone on. And we get called names like, xenophobe, and that we're racist if we even have concerns over some of the things happening.
Yeah, and I've been overseas almost my whole life. I've been to many Muslim countries. I just got back from 7 months in Europe, and I've seen what's happening there. The reality is that there's no phobia and there's no hatred. In fact, if we love these people, we need to tell them the truth. And it's the same with LGBT or Islam. The truth is that God created the world, and he came here in the person of Jesus Christ and died for your sins. And there's nothing wrong with telling people that. In fact, if we believe that that's true, it would be hateful not to tell them. Right. And yet we're being told here that we need to be silent, that Christianity is wrong, that Christianity is hateful. And what's happening is really the fundamental transformation of our societies. They're breaking down the Christian foundations of our societies that are based on the truths that God revealed to us in the Bible and through his creation, and setting up something that's completely alien, including breaking down the national identities to move toward regional and then global government. So both of these, the LGBT movement and the mass importation of Islam into Western countries, they're both being used as battering rams against the church. And I think that's the key point to realize here. They are being used to break down the moral values and the truths on which our societies were built.
Mm-hmm. And you know, some people would say, well, you're just being alarmist, and they're good people, and we just, you know, need to embrace them and love them. Some are coming from really war-torn areas and, you know, as refugees. And so what is the balance as a Christian between that and the concern about, I mean, even in Canada here, we're facing a lot more that are running for political office, some that want Sharia law to come in?
Yeah, well, you know, speaking of the deep state, I think what's very clearly happened here is that this is a planned operation. If you look, for example, at all the countries that people are ostensibly fleeing from, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ivory Coast, they all have something in common, and that is that they were all the targets of military intervention or globalist intervention by either the UN or NATO or the US government. And then, so they destroy a bunch of countries, and then they roll out the red carpet and they say, hey, why don't you guys come here? We'll give you free apartments, free education, free healthcare. So this was a deliberate operation. This was planned this way. People like Peter Sutherland, the late Peter Sutherland, who served as the UN migration czar, actually made very clear what was happening. Their goal is to break down national identities, to break down national sovereignty, and move us all toward this global society. And you know, we're seeing that. It's a little bit further advanced in Western Europe. You have now Brits are a minority in their own capital city in London. They have a Muslim mayor. And this is the future of the Western world, because the hope is to break down any civilizations or cultures or societies that might resist this agenda. And the perfect way to do that is to completely smash national identity by bringing in millions of people who come from different cultures, with different languages, with different histories, and that's what's happening.
Right. And I think, Tanya, you're all over it about what's going on in Canada with people that are getting positions, you know, high up, and that do not necessarily represent our Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah, it's really shocking and very concerning what's going on in Canada, and we know that Justin Trudeau is fully supporting it because, you know, he has publicly said that Canada will be the first post-national state with no core identity. Well, you know, I'm sorry, sir, but our country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and it's embedded in our Magna Carta. It forms our laws, and it's what sets us apart from totalitarian regimes. So how come it is that in Canada, in America, these individuals are being permitted to even run for office when they have ideologies that are foreign and political and not in the best interest of the nation that they're entering? So in other words, they're taking failed foreign governance and bringing it into this country, and we're supposed to sit back and stay silent on it. That, you know, it's just
or
not,
we're called terrible names.
Terrible
and
names,
we have to
right?
face social terrorism
yeah,
here.
back to the, you know, war on our minds of trying to call us all these different names. But one of them that I think they're wearing that out, and they know it, because people are coming around and saying, I'm not a racist. You know, I've grown up, I have Chinese friends, Filipino friends, they're out at rallies with me, you know, they're equally concerned. And they say, Tanya, we left, you know, China in order to, you know, flee communism, and we see the same thing happening here. I mean, immigrants who have come to Canada and chosen to make Canada their home are welcome here. And they're the ones that are concerned about the future of this country, equally to the European individuals that have lived here for a lifetime. And so to call us racist and intolerant is, you know, really quite foolish. And now, you know, Chrystia Freeland is calling us white supremacy is the, you know, number one concern for Canadians. Well, no, it's not. It's political Islam.
Right. And isn't it true, Alex, that a lot of the murders that happen around the world, they're done by, Islamists against, in fact, Muslim people?
It is. Actually, that's very true. Most of the victims of terrorism are actually Muslims. Most of the victims of Islamist terrorism are actually Muslims. And there's a long history of this. You know, this didn't happen in a vacuum. They have been trying to invade Europe since, 700, you know, the year 700. If you look at what they did to North Africa was once Christian. And basically they came and they either said you convert or you lose your head. And tens of thousands of people lost their heads. If you look at what the Ottomans did, they exterminated the Armenian Christians and the Assyrian Christians. That is where this is all going to go. And, you know, on the surface of things, you see like radical feminists and the LGBT movement and the socialists allied with radical Islam. And on the surface, that doesn't make any sense at all. But then you realize they all have a common enemy, and that is the Christian church and the Christian worldview. Once that's their target. Once they hope they eliminate that, they'll go after each other. But in the meantime, they have a common enemy, and that's us.
It's almost like Survivor.
Right.
It's in a really global sense. It's worrying. It's concerning when you talk about this. When you see what's happening in Europe, is it too late? How do you go back?
I think for big parts of Europe, it now is too late. I mean, God can intervene and miraculous things can happen. There may be a revival. People go back to church and go back to the roots, the faith of their forefathers. But big parts of Europe are now, in my opinion, completely gone, completely lost. You can go through entire European towns that are now dominated by Islam. The local church was purchased by an Islamic association and turned into a mosque. And a lot of radical Islamists have been bragging about this. They've been celebrating this. They say, "Oh, we'll come and have 20 babies and a victory for Allah," and these types of things. So they're openly celebrating this, while people in the West are too scared to even talk about it. Right. It's very, very strange. But I think for big parts of Europe, it's probably too late.
Right. One of the frustrations as I've gotten more and more involved in politics in my personal life is that the church wants to remain fairly silent. They don't want to necessarily, it's not all churches and it's not all pastors, but many pastors, we don't want to talk about this. But then you find that the other side is really talking about it. They are beginning to march together en masse with goals that are not for for Christianity for sure. And we're silent. Is that what you're finding in the U.S. as well? Oh,
that's absolutely the case. I would say the great majority of pastors are actually unwilling to speak out on a lot of these issues because they think somebody in their congregation might be offended. And the fact is, truth can be offensive. When you tell people that there's only one way to heaven, and that's through Jesus Christ, some people will find that offensive, but that is the truth. And if you love those people, if you care for their eternal soul, you will tell them the truth, whether that's going to be offensive or not. And the reality is a lot of pastors are too scared about the schools. The pastors, a lot of them, they know this, but they're scared that maybe some public school teacher is going to be offended. We need to get over our fear of having somebody call us a bad name or be offended, and recognize that the truth is a more important value than those things.
I look at the LGBTQ community. In and of themselves, they just wanted the right to love whoever they wanted to love, and then same-sex marriage was approved. But then we've got the other side, and that's the LGBTQ political sex activist movement, who are swinging so far to absurd that they're now hurting.
The backlash, I think, is really beginning to happen.
The progress that the LGBTQ gay and lesbian community had made.
Right.
So now, more and more citizens around the world are being offended by what it is, because it's so invasive into my personal home, into my personal life. And so we do have to take a step up. And then we've got the Islamic community where, they say, well, there's the progressive Muslims and the moderate Muslims, and, they were being persecuted as well. But the problem is that extremism follows them wherever they go. And they have the power and the money behind them. So they have become, the progressive and moderates have become irrelevant because they didn't find success in any of the 57 Muslim majority countries. They're not finding success of safety in Europe and the UK, and they're certainly not finding success now in Canada and the USA, but they are putting the rest of us in danger. So how long do we let this go on before we have to say, I'm sorry, but you need to make a hard choice. Mm-hmm. You either come to Canada, integrate and assimilate, or go back to a country where they are going to, support your ideologies. Right. Because it is putting a national security threat on the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that's where we're at.
Right. Yeah. And other things, Alex, combined with all of this is just the craziness of the government and all of the money and Soros and all of these things. And you know a lot about that, and you track it, and you're a journalist in this regard.
Yeah, well, one of the things I've been trying to expose for a number of years now is this term that Trump popularized, the deep state. And I think it's important to realize we're dealing with a spiritual battle here. Ephesians 6:12 tells us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, spiritual wickedness, darkness in high places. So it is a spiritual battle at its core, but there are also components of it that are manifested in the physical world. I mean, the devil's got a lot of dummies, useful idiots, and minions who are proudly doing his work. And if we don't recognize that this exists, like the Bible tells us it exists, we're not going to understand current events. And so one of the things I've tried to do is expose there's semi-secret organizations like the Bilderberg and these gatherings. I've actually been to 2 of the meetings, obviously not as an invited guest. The Trilateral Commission, and even some of their little secret societies. They've got the Bohemian Grove in Northern California. Stephen Harper was there, Peter MacKay, a lot of prominent Canadians go to these things too. And, the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, secret society that is just absolutely obsessed with death. And what are the odds that in 2004 our Republican candidate for president would be a member of the secret society, and the Democrat, John Kerry, would be a member of the secret society?
Wow.
1 in a trillion, right? And so that's how they do. And I think if we don't understand that all of this is going on, we don't really have a good picture of what's happening or what to do about it.
Right. And, there's some real exposure of pedophile rings and things like that. And, this is a terrifying thing. And some of us are thinking, we're just normal, good people. And we think, this is impossible. Is this really going on?
Yeah, and I think that's a big mistake that normal, everyday people make. They think, well, I wouldn't do something like that, so nobody would.
Why
but all
would
you have
they?
to, right, but all you have to do is look through history, look around the world, and you'll see that the Bible is right when it calls Satan the prince of this world. This world is fallen. It is completely mired in sin. It's getting worse, and so we should expect that evil people, fallen people, sinful people would occupy positions of power. And it just so happens that some very, very sick individuals have managed to weasel their way into power. A lot of it's coming out now. There's been a lot of pedophilia scandals in the UK with the government leadership and even people in the media, Jimmy Savile. And now some of it's coming out in the United States too. Some of these emails that were leaked from John Podesta going to spirit cooking meetings. If you want to be creeped out, go see some of the stuff they're up to. Or I mentioned Bohemian Grove. 2,500 of the most powerful men in the world get together in the redwood forests of Northern California. They've got a 40-foot stone owl, and they put on these hoods and robes, and they start chanting to the spirits, and they burn what they claim is a human effigy at the feet of this owl. This reads just like the stuff that the Canaanites were doing.
Right. It's like a
demonic.
novel, and a Monday night movie,
Right.
That's scary.
Yep.
And it's real.
It is.
Yeah, because real video has been taken. This is factual.
Oh yeah, a journalist actually got into this meeting and recorded it. You can see the video on YouTube. I think there's a 20-minute clip of what they were doing. The cremation of care, one of many rituals that they do in these little secretive gatherings.
Right. See, here in Canada, we want to believe that we're just not that crazy. That's the rest of the world, But when you mention some of the people that are involved in stuff like this, it's just so alarming. So, Alex, I know that that you travel and you speak about the most perverse and wicked things going on in our world. What do you tell Christians about what our position should be, and what are we to do next?
Well, for me personally, one of my mottos in life, Ephesians 5:11, to be reproving and exposing evil. God told us to reprove and expose evil. Right. So why are we being silent? Why aren't we doing what God told us to do? Mm-hmm. And so, that's one of the big things. And then I tell pastors too, God put you as a leader in your church to be a shepherd to his flock. If you're not warning them about what's happening in the government schools, if you're not warning them, you're not doing the job that God has given you. And I don't mean that to diss pastors. I don't want to come across as condescending, but God gave you a responsibility, and you need to fulfill that responsibility, and that means telling the truth. Right.
And the truth is just getting scarier and scarier. And I know you face some backlash for being so vocal, Tanya.
Yeah, I've actually, been fairly fortunate thus far, but, we know the time it could be coming. God's protection has definitely been on me. And, I was reading this morning in Romans where it says, we're to help fellow Christians. And I think that help is to protect this nation, to protect our youth, faith, family, and freedom. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good, very good. Do you sense that there is a sense that Christians are saying finally we do need to stand and speak? Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they were called to stand and to speak. They didn't have to do crazy stuff. They just had to speak.
Yeah.
Really, that's what we're asked to do.
And I do see, kind of an awakening within the church in the United States. And there is a fear of persecution, but I would tell Christians, God warned you that you were going to be persecuted if you lived godly, if you followed Christ. They hated him first.
Count it all joy.
Right, they're going to hate you too, right?
What's your problem?
Because again, in a world that loves lies, that loves evil, the truth, it doesn't appeal to a lot of people. So those people will hate you, and that's okay. We should love them. We should pray for them. We should be kind to them. We should ask, that God would soften their hearts. But that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to speak the truth.
Do you think that we're going to face things like imprisonment? Do you think that we're going to face things that are really serious, and that we, in a way, have to be prepared for it, even to lay our very lives down?
I think there's a very good chance of that. And, I see some stirring, some awakenings that, maybe good things will happen, but I think there's a very real prospect, and Christians need to start preparing themselves now that you may actually have to suffer for your faith, like our brothers and sisters have for 2,000 years. In Sweden, where I spent a lot of time, actually my wife is from there, the government investigated the Bible years ago, and they said the Bible is a violation of our hate speech laws. So this is a Western government, formerly Christian society, almost 100% Christian society, where now the Bible has become hate speech, where pastors go to prison for pointing out exactly what God says in His Word about things like homosexuality. And so I think there's a real chance that this is going to be coming to America, to Canada. We've already seen, imprisoning people who won't give out homosexual marriage licenses. We've seen persecution of people who won't use their God-given talents to celebrate homosexuality. The famous baker in Colorado who was persecuted. And I think this may be just the beginning. And so as a church, as God's church, as the body of Christ in this world, we need to be prepared for what God told us to be prepared for.
Right. And you know what I find the irony of all of it is that really, as the church, as Canadian Western civilization, and even in America, but especially Canada, we're very accepting of people's diverse perspectives. We kind of, like I always say, well, God said, choose you this day who you will serve, right? And we're like, if you want to be gay, lesbian, pansexual, polyamorous, we don't know what it all means, but you're fine because you're in Canada and we accept your right to do that so that we can have our right to also worship our God in the way that we want. But actually, it's the disrespect from the other side towards us that's causing this. Would you say that's an accurate?
Absolutely. I mean, tolerance is a Christian virtue. God never told us to, and it would be ridiculous to try to force faith on somebody. It's just not possible. God will ultimately be involved with that. But all these concepts that the other side has weaponized and used against us, these are Christian concepts. Even the concept of human rights. We have human rights because we're created in the image of God, because God gave us human rights. Otherwise, there's no objective reason why there should even be a such thing as human rights. And as we move further away from the Christian foundations of our society, people are going to realize that all those wonderful things that we took for granted, all the fruit of that Christian society are going to go. And that's going to be unpleasant for everyone.
For everyone, absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing your perspective, Alex. It's been amazing. Tanya, as always, continue the good work. We need you in Canada, and we thank you for that. Thank you very much. God bless. We'll see you next time.